Welcome, everyone. My name is Bridget Hall, and I'm the solution leader for real-time payments at ACI. And today, we are going to be talking about real-time payments and real-time fraud. And I'm excited to bring some lessons that we've learned from around the world with our customers at ACI and kind of talk about how it's easy to be really anxious with real-time payments and the potential of fraud that can be associated with it. However, today I'm hoping to discuss that that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So first of all, what does it actually mean to be real-time? Well, there's more to being real-time than just the immediacy of moving funds. There's also some business impacts that go along with it. Now, it must be fast. Fully completing and settling end-to-end transactions in less than 5 seconds with good funds available for settlement. And when there is good funds for settlement, then that means that there's additional management on the liquidity management side for volatility with the real-time settlement of the transaction. It also means needing more sophisticated fraud. Because the transactions are irrevocable, we need to make sure that we're doing a good job on preventing fraud before the transaction is complete. And it also means being connected. Now, we're starting to see the lines between consumer and corporates blur, and being able to connect to the expanding networks that are being available and new endpoints that are starting to become available. Now, there's roughly 20 schemes live today, but we're seeing that expand every year. So real-time payments isn't actually a new phenomenon, but the rate of deployment is speeding up. Specifically within the last few years, we're seeing a lot of new schemes become available. New schemes mean new customer demands and new government mandates, but it also means that we need to learn some additional lessons. Now, the dates that we're looking at here isn't anything new that we've seen before, but there are a few key lessons here that I wanted to point out from some of the previously launched schemes. The first one is availability. Now, 24/7, 365 availability is something that we expect from schemes that are planning to go live now. However, older schemes, like Japan, was only available between 8:30 and 4:40. Switzerland, theirs is available 24 hours, but only during the 5 business days of the week, not on nights, weekends, and holidays. Now, Brazil and Nigeria also operate in general business hours, and Turkey operates from 8:30 to 5:30, but their settlement occurs at 4:40 each day using the RTGS system. New schemes are expected to have that always on, always available nature. We're also learning that ubiquity is quite important. Of course, that means all banks, but it also means all PISPs, all AISPs, and so on. So for example, in 2017, the Bank of England extended direct access to the RTGS accounts for non-bank service providers, allowing them access to the faster payment system. We're also seeing TIPS in the European Central Bank that utilizes the T2 model, where PISPs are allowed to have a sponsor bank and allowing them to connect directly into the scheme. Now, transaction limits are also increasing as real-time payments becomes to be more available. The UK faster payments, when it initially launched in 2008, the transaction amount was relatively low. But by 2010, that transaction limit increased to £100,000. By 2015, it increased to £250,000. Now, they've talked about increasing that limit of the transaction dollar amount to £20 million by 2018. Well, we haven't quite seen that happen yet, but it's certainly not off the table. We're also discovering that global standards is a must. Using the ISO 20022 messaging standard, it allows for additional data to travel alongside the transaction. Now, this granular information helps with compliance, regulatory system, anti-money laundering, know your customer, and other audit processes with the additional information available on the transaction. And finally, overlay services are also being utilized in complete real-time schemes. The use of these overlay services is to drive additional value to consumers and payments players while reducing costs. We're definitely seeing this with Swift GPI in providing transparency on the transaction throughout the process. We're seeing a significant amount of the world move to real time. Quite a few countries have already gone live with real-time payments. Several more we're expecting to see live within the next few years, and a few more, including Canada, are in the design and discussion phase. Now, within these countries, we're seeing many API-enabled overlay services being launched, with many countries having more than one. For example, in the US, it's quite young with real-time adoption, with only having a couple of years under their belt using TCH and Zelle. Now, TCH and Zelle are two companies that are owned by member banks, and there's quite a bit of overlap between the two. However, they are operated separately. Now, Zelle has created quite a comfortable consumer habit of utilizing a mobile banking app to complete P2P transactions. With TCH supporting real-time rails and their request for pay on the same scheme, it's really only a matter of time until Zelle is driving the digital overlay and bill payment and merchant payments are available for real-time payments in the US. Now, TCH and Zelle, they're not the only ones with this idea. MasterCard has announced that they are planning to go live with Bill Pay Exchange in August of this year by utilizing some technology from their VocaLink acquisition. Now, BPX will leverage this to be able to put request to pay into the hands of banks, billers, and merchants. It's planning to ride the real-time rails of TCH, so it'll be quite interesting to see how BPX and Zelle interact with each other while riding those same rails. There we go. So now across the pond in Europe, we're also seeing some development happen here as well. Just recently, we had Barclays announce the extension of their partnership with VocaLink to take their Pay by Bank app, which is quite similar to BPX in the US, to their 6 million consumers, with the intent to extend this to merchants by 2020. Now, non-card digital payments have had a bit of a challenge in getting traction in the UK. However, UK Faster Payments certainly thinks that this has legs. They've asked Accenture to complete a study to determine what the market potential of requests for pay would be. And they found that it would benefit the UK economy by 1.3 billion British pounds. Ideal in the Netherlands, Swish in Sweden, and Mobile Pay in Denmark are also showing increased transaction growth for merchant transactions. Now, of course, we can't talk about instant and open payments without talking about India. This market has seen phenomenal growth with instant and open payments. And one of the giants here in India digital payments is Paytm. They reported not too long ago that 50% of all India utility payments went through their platform, which is connected to the scheme of Unified Payment Interface in India. Now, as with any new channel or payment type, we have to expect that fraudsters are going to try to take advantage of the new avenues available to them. However, what we often see with real-time is because the window of the transaction is so small, say 15 seconds, that fraudsters are actually migrating the portion of the transaction that they're targeting. Rather than focus on the payment part of the transaction, they're focusing on the customer experience portion, which is actually more of a social engineering fraud rather than a technological scam. Now, the UK's experience here with real-time payments, and it's provided quite a valuable lesson for us, understanding the dynamic between real-time payments and fraud. When the UK Faster Payments was first launched, there wasn't a lot of industry understanding on where potential fraud could happen with banks and consumers. Now, unfortunately, fraudsters knew exactly what they were doing here. Today's fraudsters are well-versed in banking regulation, and they know exactly where to target the fraud within the transaction part. Real-time payments are irrefutable, and they can be done in a subsequent manner so that the fraud is virtually untraceable by routing through the different transactions. However, the industry did respond quite well in the UK, and now we see that the fraud rates for traditional push payments is lower than that of credit cards. Of course, fraudsters never last for long. They're always looking for the new avenues, and we're seeing a rise in a new type of fraud in the UK called, what's the name of it here? called interception fraud. So what this is doing is the fraudsters are gleaning information off of social media, physical mail, and web scrapes to insert themselves into the conversation to appear not fraudulent. So they'll create a communication that appears to be from a expected supplier, such as a builder. However, the account details attached to where the payment is being sent is to that of the fraudster rather than the true supplier. Now, this type of behavior wasn't originally caught by UK Faster Payments because they weren't verifying the information of the recipient. They were more so verifying that the account number and the sort code was in the right format to make sure that the payment was successful. However, when it was discovered that this specific type of fraud was costing UK consumers about £1 million per day, banks did step up and they agreed to reimburse victims for this fraud, which in turn raised the stakes for all involved. Banks also took this opportunity to launch the Take 5 for fraud to educate consumers on the types of fraud available to them and how to protect themselves. Now, additional services that identify the payee improve their current situation, but that's only one side of the identity. ISO 20022 messaging also positions the market to capitalize off of the richer data that flows alongside the transaction. And new real-time schemes are being launched with this new messaging standard. Now, when Zelle initially launched in the US, there was some fraud, which is normal for any new payment type that launches. But unfortunately, they did receive some negative press around the fraud that did happen. However, they didn't highlight all of the positive experiences that happened, as well as all of the additional benefits that Zelle brought to consumers in the US. This brief wave of negative press did affect the entire ecosystem in the US, and it did slow down adoption for a bit on continued use of Zelle. Now, currently, Interac fraud levels are quite low in Canada, and Canadian banks are doing a great job on preventing fraud. However, we expect that there will be some new challenges to face as new payment types are introduced and transaction dollar limits are increased. Investing more in your real-time scheme will provide some new great benefits to your customers, but it's also quite important to protect your customers from the fraud associated with launching a new payment type. Now, in Canada, you have the opportunity to learn from the lessons that we've seen in the UK and the US. Setting up fraud protection on real-time payments can be done in advance of the e-transfer going to the real-time rails. Now, there's an opportunity here to shift the liability off of banks. However, that liability can't just be sent to the consumer because consumers are used to credit card level protection of fraud. Making the right decision on whether or not a transaction is fraudulent is critical due to the irrevocable nature of that transaction. However, it also needs to be done quickly to ensure that the real-time payment transaction is completed within that real-time frame. Those that have been most successful in preventing fraud in real-time payments has worked with the consumer. For example, the screenshot on the left here, there we go. For example, the screenshot on the left here is from my UK colleague's phone from a banking app that she used when she went to pay a new payee via Faster Payments. Now, she hopped in and out of her banking app to make sure that she was putting in the correct account details from her email into the app. And this is a classic sign for authorized push payment fraud. Now, on this occasion, she knew that the transaction wasn't fraudulent because she had texted the payee previously asking for the invoice. However, the bank took this opportunity to validate with her whether or not the transaction was fraudulent. Now, you can see in the language in the app there that it's very educational and collaborative, but it's also firm and fair. And once she checked the box and clicked continue, her transaction was completed in real time. The use of this data and flipping back and forth between apps is just one source. The more data sources that are incorporated, the better chance that you have to prevent the fraud from happening. Machine learning is one of the tools that we use to make complex decision making with several data sources, ensuring that we allow you to manage what data sources are included to use as many as possible to prevent fraud. This one specifically with behavior biometrics gives you the understanding of what is normal for your customer and their behavior versus what could potentially be fraudulent. Now, the Canadian market is well placed to take advantage of the opportunities that drives value throughout the transaction chain. Consumers have greatly increased their use of e-transfer over the last couple of years, as have corporate customers. With real-time familiarity, we expect the Canadian market to adopt faster than other countries around the world on value-added services to address other applications, such as bill payment and reimbursements and increase in transaction limits. Utilizing the richer ISO 20022 messaging standard will allow FIs, fintechs, paytechs, and so on to leverage the rich data that flows alongside the transaction to understand market trends, to also create new products and value-added services for consumers and business needs. Specifically, those that potentially create efficiencies. And when creating efficiencies, we would also expect that this would be cost savings as well. Now, according to a new study by Payments Canada and EY Canada, Canadian business methods that are currently used to complete transaction processing costs between 2.9 and 6.5 billion Canadian dollars annually. Payments Canada anticipates that there is as much savings as $4.5 billion over a 5-year period by replacing checks with electronic transactions that have the richer data that's flowing along with it. We're also seeing significant evidence in North America in regards to real-time merchant activity and the transaction growth there. The demand for faster payments across all market sectors is clear, that most recipients want to receive their payments faster. Now, 62% of North American consumers would likely opt in for real-time fund disbursements if it were available. And 96% of North American merchants report that they would like to use real-time payments if the price remained constant. This is quite a sizable opportunity for merchants, and it's estimated at about $18.5 trillion in addressable payments volume. Now, Ovum has found that 65% of merchants in Europe want to accept instant payments. And this percentage has been increasing year over year. Now, the important question here is why? Well, we know that a vast majority, 82%, understand the benefits that are attached to instant payments. But there's two key benefits that they specifically highlight. Improving the bottom line. Well, that's often done by reducing costs. And reducing costs frees up funds. There's quite a bit we can do with freed up funds. The other option, the other benefit, is the holy grail that all merchants try to do, improved customer experience. And for merchants, that means happy customers. Happy customers tell other people about their happy experiences and continue to drive customers to that merchant, which then increases revenue. So we've got reducing costs and increasing revenue. Really, really good benefits. Now, India is a great example of the phenomenal adoption that can happen with real-time payments in an open market. So we know that India is very low card, high cash in their use. And the intention of real-time payments is to not only reduce the cost associated with checks and cash, but to also introduce new payment types. So in 2016, the National Payment Council of India launched a digital method sitting on top of their immediate payment rails called Unified Payment Interface, UPI. UPI originally started as a P2P method and was launched with a lot of the Wave 2 initiatives and enhancements that we're expecting to see in UK 2.0 coming next year. The P2P started in August of 2016, but in September of 2018, they extended that to person to merchant. And now consumers can use WhatsApp, Paytm, Walmart Flipkart, Google Pay, and as of February, Amazon Pay to complete transactions, P2P, P2B, and so on. Now this chart is showing the digital payments growth from the launch in August 2016 until about a couple of months ago. You can see that it is significantly growing over the last couple of years in true hockey stick style. And we do expect that that growth is going to continue over the next few years. And it's also important to note that the growth is coming from both credit card and faster payments, but faster payments is growing at a higher rate than card payments. It's been reported that 24% of all of the UPI transactions that are happening are coming from merchant payments, either through point of sale or e-commerce. Again, we are seeing this grow rapidly in the merchant area, and we expect that this growth to expand faster with the launch of Amazon Pay this year. Now, regulation forced UPI onto the scene, and banks simply had to adopt with what was happening. It also forced in the marketplace, and with consumer need, banks just had to keep up. They couldn't adopt fast enough to meet the consumer demand that we're seeing in the growth here. Now, with regulation coming in Canada, banks have the opportunity now to start thinking about how they're going to prepare for what we know is coming to be ready. Now, being ready ahead of the market will allow that first mover advantage and the ability to implement in such a way that you can make money from overlay services and find new innovations on the real-time rail. Now, piggybacking on the ISO changes, TCH introduced a credit push model on the rails of its scheme known as Request to Pay. Now, this operates as a message request, and it puts both the business and the consumer in the driver's seat for the transaction. There's a distinct opportunity to innovate more value-added services for merchants and corporates, including C2B and B2C for the disbursement side. Now, Lippis Advisor and ACI partnered on a project to project the future of real-time bill payments and the market opportunity there. Lippis forecasted by 2022 that the volume of real-time biller payments is expected to be 275 million transactions, with annual growth expected between 68 and 283%. They're expecting a lot of growth in this specific area. And to take advantage of this market opportunity, banks need to be able to enable the businesses that are their customers. They need to capitalize on the additional data that's attached to these transactions and have a focus on their customer and what their needs are. So this is what we're hearing from banks right now. How do we implement real-time disbursements while managing where TPPs get access to our system and with minimal impact to my current setup? So separating this a bit, there's a business challenge, a technical challenge, and solution needs. Now on the business challenge part, you need to provide your corporate customers with real-time disbursements. However, this needs to be done while preserving existing workflows for customers, including batch files. It also needs to be quick to market to maintain the customer relationships that you already have. And it needs to be able to deliver on current needs while maintaining your long-term strategy. From the technical challenge perspective, you may have been an early adopter to real-time payments on the retail side of the bank. However, the B2C functionality on the wholesale needs to provide a consistent experience across the bank. Now, of course, there's complex workflows that are probably going to need to be reused. And there's also not enough budget to do individual use cases. So some of the changes are probably going to need to be done incrementally. And there's always uncertainty of what types of payments are going to take hold and those that aren't. None of us can really see the future, so we have to sort of evolve as the market does as well. It's also important to choose the right solution. You need something that allows you to be quick to market and future-proofed to know what's coming. The deployment expectations need to meet organizational needs now while continuing to track with your long-term strategy. But it also needs to maintain alignment on the retail side as well, so that you have that customer feel that's consistent across the organization. And there's also that need for future flexibility to bring together the wholesale banking solution and integrate it with the real-time flows. Now, this is quite a tall order, but is it possible? Absolutely. And one of your own is already doing this today. Bank of Montreal is the 8th largest bank in North America. They have more than 12 million customers, and they wanted to bring real-time payments to them. Well, thankfully, they worked with ACI to use our Up real-time payment solution. And BMO was able to see a faster time to market. They had better management of their cash flow. They had simplified connectivity to their new payment types and transparency for their customers throughout the transactions. Now, you certainly don't have to take my word for it. BMO recently won the Celent Model Bank 2019 award for their Payment Services Hub innovation. And you can read more about how BMO got ahead of the curve at aciworldwide.com/BMOCelent. So we've got a little bit of time left for questions here. And I'd like to bring David Grindle up from ACI. David is our Director of Solution Consulting and our Canadian expert, who is quite an expert for Canada, for ACI.
I'm here for Canadian content.
Is there any questions? Anyone have a question for Bridget and David?
I guess so. We need some more coffee in the room today.
What kind of fraud trends did you see? Like one of the fraud, what I saw, what you said was about getting the emails and phishing the emails and doing the work kind of thing, kind of fraud. But what other kind of trends of frauds did we see during the launch in India, UK, and everyone else? Because I think the first of the things is they started with a really high fraud and then they kind of brought it down. So what kind of trends they saw and how they brought those things down? And how can Canadian market look at those trends and use those trends to say that we don't make the same mistakes that UK or India or everywhere else in the world they've already made earlier?
Yeah, so we're seeing the fraud happen in different parts of the transaction, and it's certainly changing throughout, and we're seeing it evolve, certainly. So the fraud that we've seen in other parts of the world is focusing on the customer experience and how that looks. So really thinking about the behavioral biometrics on what the customer is doing and the changes that they're making, and the fraudsters are targeting that piece of the transaction on the consumer part.
I'll speak a little bit to the UK experience, which had a very significant fraud when they went live with FasterPay. The fraud detection layers the banks put on weren't specifically targeted at an immediate payment. It was more around the channels, the web banking, and then later the mobile interfaces. And they very much found they needed a multi-layer approach. So there was, call it standard web banking security and fraud improvements. So looking for immediate payments to a new payee. I mean, that's kind of obvious, but so it was a series of small things. But they also then layered in a number of other tools. So you had an entire ecosystem. Everything from IP geolocation to make sure that your customer is coming from where you think he's coming. On the mobile side, they've layered in biometrics that under their software providers that know how you use a phone, whether you typically swipe left to right, right to left, you use your thumbs, use your fingers. So that's in and of itself doesn't bring up a fraudulent signal, but is one more data input to your fraud systems to then potentially do a step-up challenge. They very much found it was a multi-layer approach to try and chip away at it.
Rachel, we have one in the back there.
Sorry. Thank you. So what do merchants need to do to take advantage of the benefits you highlighted? How do merchants need to prepare? What do they need to put in place?
Yeah, So I think merchants really need to think about what they want to offer to their consumers and what they have available to be able to implement the faster payments type within their system and with their relationship with their bank. David, do you have any thoughts to add on that?
Yeah, the merchant faces a channel problem, right? Because they're accepting both brick and mortar. Eventually, we need to figure out the human POS interface for an immediate payment, whether that's going to be a 2D barcode or whatever that interface is going to be, and that's one of the biggest challenge. Over 30 years, we've made the card transaction model at the point of sale really quick and efficient. So that's going to be very difficult to displace. I think merchants also need to look to their e-commerce and online channels, because I think you'll see just as much of a swing in immediate payments there. With a properly screened immediate payment transaction, you eliminate a lot of the credit card fraud that comes in the e-commerce channel. So you could, the merchant could put up a barcode on the screen. He could put, whatever that user interface is going to be, and I'll actually do an immediate payment for my e-commerce goods as opposed to a card payment. So that's the merchant challenge. He's got to do it in both channels.
Rachel, I've got a couple over here.
I was just wondering if you have any metrics or statistics on fraud in, say, India or China, where other real-time and instant payments are alive and well and have been for a while.
I do not have any of those statistics with me today, unless you happen to know any off the top of your head. No? We don't have any with us today, but certainly we could connect afterwards and pull some from our team. Oh.
Follow-on question to that. You did a great overview of what's happening internationally, and I wonder if you have a view on what countries launched most successfully in terms of controlling fraud, and what are the learnings that you have from that? For instance, I understand Netherlands is very low fraud. Is there something we can learn from those other jurisdictions?
Do you have any thoughts on Netherlands? Well, I think we've certainly seen successes in several different schemes. Each scheme has kind of had their good and their bad. Specifically for those that have launched within the last couple of years, since we're seeing so much evolve from fraudsters and that they get smarter and faster and they understand more of the ecosystem around real-time payments and how they launch today. We're seeing that fraud is getting a little bit more advanced on some of that. So we're certainly learning the most lessons from those that are going live within the last couple of years. UK was certainly one that we learned a lot from, not because it was a bad launch of it, but just because we've seen new additional features that have been launched with it compared to those that were launched 15, 20 years ago with the changes in technology in general. Yeah, we've got one up front here, Rachel.
So I'm not sure if this is appropriate for this session, but can you speak to the cost and the revenue component of supporting a real-time payment? So I think consumers expect the transaction to be free and immediate. How does that translate to corporate payment mentality, right, where the price point will be and who's absorbing, I guess, the cost of development or potential revenue? Should we expect that to shrink?
Sure. So it's going to be different with every scheme. We see some that we expect them to be completely free, and then we've seen some where the real-time payment, there is a small cost associated with completing the transaction from the consumer perspective. And from the corporate perspective, of course, there's a cost for them to do that. But there's also a cost for them to handle cash transactions, check transactions, debit card transactions. There's always a cost. And with real-time payments, we're expecting the processing cost of an electronic payment with the data attached to it to be significantly less than the processing cost of a check, where you're employing a much more extensive hands-on processing for that. So from your question around cost, well, it's going to be in there somewhere, but sometimes it might be just shifting the dollars on where they sit based on the different transactions. Anything to add on that?
And to drive the lower costs, it's essential then to drive to single infrastructure. So you can't have a commercial interface to your local immediate payment scheme and a consumer interface. You'll have separate channels, but they've got to come through a common interface into the scheme. So to put it into Canadian perspective, you're not going to have two interfaces into e-transfer or eventually real-time rails. And we've seen that in the States, where banks had initially fired up a consumer application to interface to Zelle, and then an entirely separate commercial application to interface to real-time payments, and then quickly realized they duplicated costs. Because while the last mile into the scheme, of course, is scheme-specific, 85% of your functionality in performing that payment is common. So you should be able to take a common rail. Ultimately, you get to our BMO example of a payment hub. You get to a common set of functionality that does everything from authorization to fraud to, if necessary, OFAC to a CRM interface, whatever interfaces you need to process that payment. And then the last decision is this going out, Zelle, RTP. Do I have, is the dollar amount such that maybe it's actually a wire? Can I wait 5 days and I'll send it ACH? So much of that payment processing is common, you only need to really switch at the end. So that drives costs down significantly. You eliminate entire applications.
Okay. Go, Rachel, you have one.
Do you have any views in terms of what fraud functionality should be offered by the payment system? So what functionality should be in the center versus what functionality tends to be more naturally done by FIs?
I'm sorry, what was that very last word? By?
So what parts of fraud protection should be done by FIs? So really I'm asking about, in other countries, what do you find in terms of trends of the common fraud prevention tools that should be within the center offered by the faster payment system versus what fraud prevention functionalities generally belong to the FIs?
The scheme versus the bank.
Okay. So focusing on the bank part of it, when the transaction is going through the bank has the best opportunity to work with their consumer on what is normal behavior for their consumer on the account level. So we certainly see a good opportunity for fraud to sit at that level, to be able to identify the transaction with the information available to them. On the scheme level, I don't know if it's quite as much. If you have some thoughts on that.
The answer you might expect is both. Excuse me. And because fraud detection is mostly about data availability, so as the originating bank has a better idea of the originator, of the usage, the web fraud, the banking, web banking client interactions that I spoke at a few minutes ago, and has an enterprise-wide view of what that consumer or corporate has done. Is this a regular payee? Is it a regular dollar amount? They can do step-up authentication. So the originating bank has a huge role. But then the scheme has data the originating bank doesn't have. The scheme sees a concentration of payments to an account. The scheme, if you go back to the old card world, the scheme could see things like points of compromise. The scheme will always have a better global picture of payment flows than the bank. But what's interesting now is you're also seeing, it used to be that on the recipient side, well, there's no fraud, there's good funds coming in. But with some of the authorized push payments we're seeing in markets like the UK, this was the largest of the Zelle exploits. A fraudster would set up a fake merchant, sell things using Zelle as his method of purchase, take the cash and disappear because there's no chargebacks and it's finality. So the receiving bank should have actually been seeing that they should have done more validation around the fake merchant and the fact that this account was receiving so many payments inbound. Right? So you're actually seeing fraud detection responsibilities that should fall on all three parties: originator, scheme, and receiver.
David? So in line with your question or your comments around the recipient, we heard from the example that Bridget provided and what you just added there was that it's really been focusing, fraud controls have been focusing on the initiator of the payment. So if you think about also validating the recipient, what sort of opportunity is there to do that? Where is it done? Is it done at the scheme? Is it done somewhere else? How do we close that loophole for fraudsters?
Ask the easy questions, Tracy. I don't know if I have all the answers. I think a payment validation, an addressee validation service is one of the key building blocks. I don't know if we have all the answers as of yet. If we did, fraud rates would be zero.
Well, I talked a little bit about that earlier, right? It's from the consumer side, when you're paying someone, that you are validating the recipient details along with the account information to make sure that that's matching up. So I think there's some improvement that can be done there. Certainly we haven't solved all fraud yet, and I don't know if we ever will. But it's kind of, it's using both sides of the equation, because you can't just solve one side of the equation. You need to understand the other piece of it.
The move to authorized push payments has been a new vector. So I'm a huge fan of two-factor authentication. I'd like to see a little more of that coming out of the Canadian banks. So someone asked about Netherlands a few minutes ago. The Netherlands were a very early adopter of two-factor web banking logons. And it's funny how it's always the losses in the business case that drive decisions. For corporate payment initiations, there's long been a step-up authentication, but above a certain dollar amount, you need to go to 4 eyes or 6 eyes. Two-factor authentications for dollar amounts or certain payees and the like. So it's always been on that side because the losses are so much greater. I think we need to see more, this is a personal opinion, not an ACI opinion, but I think we need to see more two-factor authentication on the initiation side. What we do, but that's not going to solve an authorized push payment. What we're going to do on the recipient side is a question we have to solve.
Similar to the Go Public story that came out this week in terms of interception of payments, have you seen that in other circumstances globally? And how has that been addressed?
That's the interception you're talking about in the UK. There's an example in Canada this week.
The interception in the UK. Oh, of the interception fraud and how they're gleaning customer detail. Sorry, can you repeat your question on that?
So in the Go Public story this week, it was email money transfer that was intercepted, and if they had auto deposit, it wouldn't have been an issue. However, the security questions were weak. A fraudster intercepted the email transfer. Assuming real-time rail isn't going to leverage the email, or maybe it will, system, have you seen other interception tactics in the global markets that have defrauded consumers or corporate customers?
Okay, yeah, so it's really about making sure that you're paying somebody that you know that you're paying, and you're paying the right person. So being able to educate consumers on how to spot that fraudulent behavior when they're doing that interception of making the communication look like it's coming from the true supplier, and it might be somebody that they're doing business with already. But it's being able to spot just pieces of it that maybe don't look quite right, or really trying to educate consumers on how that works. And that's what the UK did with their Take 5 to Stop Fraud, is educating consumers, educating banks on that this is happening and what that looks like and how to spot it. Because if you understand how to spot it and the ways that fraudsters are trying to take advantage of that, it gives them more knowledge to be able to spot it and to stop the fraud before it happens. Thoughts to add on that? Or you?
No, you captured it.
Okay.
In the payments, once we launched the RTR, which was the biggest explosion of the payments? Was it P2P, P2B, B2B, and especially going back to the part of it, did business really care that their bulk files were now being converted into RTR and being sent out, or they were like indifferent?
So I think we certainly saw a lot of P2P to start with. It's the easiest for most people to relate to in reducing cash and reducing checks. If you're splitting a dinner bill or splitting rent with a roommate or something like that, that's the one that we all easily gravitate to. So I think that's probably the one that picks up the fastest in new schemes. But once we kind of get that under our belt as a consumer of saying, okay, P2P, great, I get that, then there's more to it of the P2B and the B2B and the B2C. And what about all of these other use cases that come along with it? Specifically in the US, that's how Zelle started, was P2P. And now we are certainly seeing from TCH with their advancement of the use of their real-time rails and being innovative, and they're doing a lot of communication on the other types of the other types of transactions that are available on the different use cases. And we're seeing more creativity around how to use the real-time rails.
I would say there's demand for both, but it's easier to offer up a consumer P2P solution because all you're offering up is a web page or a mobile app, and you're enabled. Corporates have a broader range and more sophisticated payment initiation techniques. So, and this is exactly the roadmap we're seeing in the States on Zelle. Zelle was easy, and they made it very, very easy, so volumes exploded. For corporate payments on TCH, not many treasurers are going to sit down at a web screen and enter in the transaction one after another. So they want bulk file uploads in a variety of formats. They'd love it if you combine it with their other payment types. You're going to be taking in APIs from ERPs, so you have to support their Oracle system or their JD Edwards system. So there is more work to do. You have an infrastructure problem. And that, I think, is one of the big that's one of the big causes of the very slow TCH adoption in the States. The rails are up, the interfaces are up, but the banks have a great deal more work to do to enable the initiation channels to their corporates, and that's what's taking a long time. Once that's all done, I think you'll see the business usage of TCH explode as well. There was more work to be done to enable the corporates to participate.
I think we've got time for one more question. Oh, right behind you there.
Can you talk a little bit about how disputed payments are handled today in terms of when does the liability fall on the payer versus the payee versus the originating or receiving bank?
So the liability and where that falls really is dependent on the banks in the different countries. So there isn't a rule or a standard on how it should be handled. Certainly from a bank perspective, we talked earlier about the UK and how when they saw how much it was costing the consumers that the bank stepped up and took some of that liability to help that. Now, I'm sure not all banks did that on every transaction that was available. It's really kind of the bank's decision on some of that, on when they're willing to do it or not. Of course, you're competing with credit card and how they handle that, but you're also wanting to maintain a good customer experience and wanting to take care of your customers as well. So we're seeing the liability kind of shift a little bit on where it's at with different banks in different schemes in different countries. There's really no main standard of it, I would say.
Yeah, the answer I'd really say is scheme dependent. It's scheme, and obviously you're going to a consumer liability issue. It's going to be very regulatory controlled as well.
Yep. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for all coming today.
Thank you.